The morning Delia Marsh discovered that her business partner of 20 years had gone, she found three things on her desk. The first was a note, 6 lines long, written in the careful handwriting of a man who had always presented himself as careful. It said he was sorry. It said the business had been struggling for longer than she knew. It said he had done what he had to do. It did not say where he had gone. It did not explain what he meant by what he had to do. Because men who have spent 20 years doing what Gerald Cole had been doing do not generally explain themselves when they leave. The explanation is in the leaving. The explanation is in the emptiness they leave behind. The second thing was the business stamp. It was sitting in its usual place beside the telephone, the way it had sat every morning for 18 years, since they moved into the proper office on Birch Street. The rubber stamp with Marsh and Cole bookkeeping services in the circular border, and the date wheel beneath it that you adjusted each morning when you came in. She had adjusted it 10,000 times, more or less. She looked at it for a moment before she understood why it was there. He was leaving her the stamp because he was leaving her nothing else. The stamp was the one thing he could not take and could not use and had no purpose to him, and he had left it there in its usual place as the final item in an accounting she had not known she was part of. The third thing was the bank statement for the business account, printed and placed face up on her blotter. Gerald had printed it and placed it there, which told her something about the kind of man he was. The kind who wants you to know exactly where you stand at the moment of the ending. Not because he feels guilty, but because complete information is a form of control, and he had been exercising control over this situation for a long time, and was not going to stop doing it on the last morning. The balance was $14.31. Delia was 68 years old. She had built Marsh and Cole bookkeeping services with Gerald Cole over 20 years, starting in 1998, with 6 clients working out of the spare bedroom of her farmhouse on the east side of Clover Ridge County, Tennessee, and growing it year by year into a practice with 43 clients, a proper office on Birch Street in town, 2 part-time employees, and a reputation for the kind of reliable, meticulous work that small businesses and farming operations in rural Tennessee depended on and did not extend to people lightly. She had been the one who did the work. Gerald had been the one who brought in the clients and managed what he called the relationships, which meant he was the face that people saw at the Chamber of Commerce dinners and the Agricultural Association meetings and the small business roundtables that produced referrals and introductions, and the gradual expansion of the client base that had taken the practice from 6 clients to 43 over 2 decades. This division had seemed, for 20 years, not just reasonable but natural. She was good at the work, and he was good at the presenting of the work, and the combination had produced something real. It had not been a reasonable and fair arrangement. She was beginning to understand this as she stood at her desk with the 3 things in front of her, the note and the stamp and the statement with $14.31, in the specific and unpleasant way that you understand things that have been true for a long time, and that you are only now being given the evidence to see. The arrangement had been real in the sense that she had done the work, and the work had been done, and the clients had been served. But the arrangement had also been something else, a structure in which one person provided the expertise and the reputation and the labor, and another person positioned himself to benefit from all 3, while keeping the financial reality of their situation in a state of carefully managed opacity. The clients would need to be told. The office lease would need to be addressed. The accounts would need to be examined by someone other than her, because she was not, at this moment, in a condition to examine anything with the objectivity that accounting requires. There were legal procedures for what happened when a business partner disappeared with the contents of the business account, and there were questions that required an attorney, and there was, underneath all of it, the specific and queasy question of whether Gerald Cole had left anything at all, or had taken everything there was to take, and left her with a rubber stamp and $14.31 and 20 years of her working life. She did not try to answer that question on the first morning. She called her attorney instead. Sandra Briggs had handled Delia's personal affairs for 15 years and was not a woman who was easily surprised by the things people called her about. But when Delia described what was on the desk, she heard a quality enter Sandra's voice that was not quite surprise, but was its close relative. Sandra said, "Do not touch anything else on that desk. Do not open any other files and do not log into the accounting system. I will be there in an hour." Delia said, "All right?" Sandra said, "Delia, are you all right?" Delia thought about the question for a moment. She said, "I will be." Sandra said, "I know you will. I will be there in an hour." She sat down in her chair and looked out the window of the office on Birch Street, at the main road that ran through Clover Ridge, Tennessee, on a November morning. The town was going about its Tuesday morning in the way that small towns go about Tuesday mornings. The hardware store opening, the post office busy with the day's first wave, a farm truck slowing at the light and then pulling through. 20 years of Tuesday mornings in this office. She had watched this same intersection from this same window in every season and every kind of weather, and she knew the rhythms of it, the way you know the rhythms of a place you have been part of for a long time. She thought, "I built this. Whatever he took, I built this." And then she waited for Sandra. What she did not know, sitting in that chair on that Tuesday morning, was that Gerald Cole had been using a building. A concrete block warehouse on a rural property 6 miles east of Clover Ridge, leased in the name of the business for 4 years, at a cost that had appeared in the accounts as a storage expense, and that Delia had processed without questioning because Gerald had told her it was overflow storage for client document archives, which was a plausible enough explanation, and one she had accepted because she trusted him. Because she had trusted him for 20 years. Because trust, when it has been extended for 20 years without apparent cause for withdrawal, becomes a form of habit, and habits are the things we are least likely to examine. The warehouse would come up in Sandra's investigation 3 weeks later, and what it contained would change not just what Delia knew about the 20 years behind her, but what she understood about the 20 years ahead. This is her story. She had grown up in Clover Ridge County, which is the kind of place that produces a specific kind of person, someone with a practical relationship to the world, an understanding of what work actually costs, and the particular self-reliance that comes from growing up in a rural community where the distance between needing something and being able to call someone to fix it is sometimes significant enough that you learn to fix it yourself. Her father had been a farmer, and her mother had kept the farm's books, a distinction that Delia had observed closely as a child, without understanding its significance until much later. Her mother had worked at the kitchen table in the evenings after dinner with the ledgers spread out under the overhead light, adding columns with a pencil and checking her work with the methodical care of someone who understood that a mistake in a farm's books was not an abstraction, but a real thing with real consequences for real people. Delia had sat beside her and watched, and occasionally been shown how. The showing had taken root. She had studied accounting at the State University, graduated in 1977, and gone to work for a regional accounting firm in Nashville, where she had spent 16 years becoming very good at her job and watching people who were less good at their jobs advance past her with the regularity that certain workplaces reserve for people they value but do not respect. She had not been bitter about this in the moment. She had been patient, in the way that people are patient when they believe the patience is temporary and will eventually produce the result they are waiting for. The patience had not produced the result. What it had produced instead, when the firm was acquired in 1997 and it became clear that her future with the new management was limited, was the decision to stop waiting and start building. She had moved back to Clover Ridge because the 12 acres her parents had left her were there, and because she had never entirely stopped feeling, in the 20 years she had lived in Nashville, that she was somewhere other than where she was from. Not unhappily, she had a full life in Nashville, friends and work, and the particular pleasures of a city that a rural upbringing makes you appreciate more consciously than most. But when the firm was acquired and she needed to make a decision about what came next, the decision that came to her was not about Nashville. It was about Clover Ridge. The farmhouse on the 12 acres had been rented for 6 years. She moved back in during the winter of 1997 and spent 4 months fixing what needed fixing and thinking about what came next and talking to the people she knew in the county about the accounting services available to the farms and small businesses in the area, which was a conversation that told her 2 things: that the services available were adequate at best and often less than that, and that there was a real need for something better. She had the expertise. What she did not have was the network. She had been gone for 20 years, and the people who needed accounting services in Clover Ridge County were not going to trust their books to someone they did not know, regardless of her qualifications. This was the context in which Gerald Cole had seemed like a genuine solution to a real problem. He knew everyone. She knew the work. Together they could build something that neither of them could build alone. That had been true. It had also been incomplete as a description of what they had actually built. But that was what 20 years of trust looks like before the evidence arrives. Gerald Cole had been 52 years old when they formed the partnership. He was a man of considerable social ease, the kind of person who remembered names and asked about children and knew which farmers had had difficult seasons and which businesses were growing, and who used this knowledge with the skill of someone who understands that information about people, gathered carefully and deployed warmly, is the foundation of trust. He was not dishonest in his manner. This was the thing Delia came back to most often in the months after he left. He had not seemed dishonest. He had seemed like exactly what he was, a man who was good with people. The distinction she had missed, and that she was only now in a position to understand, was between a man who is good with people because he genuinely values them, and a man who is good with people because he understands that their goodwill is useful to him. These two things can look identical for a very long time. They look identical until the moment when the usefulness ends and the goodwill is no longer worth maintaining. He had a daughter from a previous marriage who lived in Memphis, and a brother in Nashville, and an apartment in Clover Ridge that he had lived in for 12 years. He had memberships in the Chamber of Commerce and the Agricultural Association and the Rotary Club, and he attended the functions of all three with the consistency of someone for whom social presence is professional infrastructure. He had, in short, the appearance of a man embedded in a community, which is not the same thing as being embedded in a community, but it is remarkably difficult to tell the difference from the inside. Delia had been on the inside for 20 years. She had known Gerald Cole's habits and preferences and opinions on most subjects, and the names of his clients, and the quality of his relationships with them, and the fact that he liked his coffee with 1 sugar and took his lunch at 12:15, and was habitually 5 minutes late to everything that did not have a client present, at which he was habitually 5 minutes early. She had known all of this and had not known the thing that mattered most. She was not going to spend a great deal of time on the question of how she had not known. She had examined it enough to understand the answer. She had not known because she had not looked, and she had not looked because she had trusted him, and she had trusted him because he had given her 20 years of reasons to trust him that had all been constructed for exactly that purpose. That was the answer. It was not a satisfying answer, but it was the correct one, and she was not a person who preferred satisfying answers to correct ones. Sandra Briggs arrived at 9:15 with a briefcase, and the particular manner of a woman who has handled enough crises to know that the first thing you do in a crisis is establish what you actually know, as opposed to what you fear. She had brought, by arrangement made in the car on the way from her office, a forensic accountant named Paul Kim, who worked out of Nashville, and who was, Sandra had explained to Delia on the phone, the person you called when you needed to understand what had been done to a set of financial records by someone who did not want it understood. Paul Kim was 44 years old and said very little and moved through the office with the quiet, systematic attention of someone reading a room the way other people read documents, noting the arrangement of things, the filing systems, the hardware, the software, the paper trails that accounting offices generate and that tell their own story to someone who knows how to read them. He spent the first 2 hours simply looking. He asked 3 questions during those 2 hours, and each question was followed by a long silence, during which he wrote something in the small notebook he carried. On the second morning, Paul Kim sat across from Delia and Sandra at the conference table and laid out what he had found in the way of a man who respects the person he is talking to enough to tell them the truth without softening it into something easier to hear. Gerald had been drawing from the business accounts through a mechanism that had been structured to avoid appearing in the regular monthly reconciliations that Delia reviewed. The mechanism was not complicated. It required access to the account and a basic understanding of how Delia's reconciliation process worked, both of which Gerald had, but it was consistent, and it was persistent, and it had been running for at least 6 years. The amounts were not individually remarkable. $200 here, $400 there, occasional larger withdrawals categorized as business expenses with descriptions that were plausible enough to pass a cursory review and that Delia, trusting the descriptions as she trusted the man who had entered them, had passed. Over 6 years, the amounts added up to something that was not $14.31. It was considerably more than $14.31, and the difference had gone somewhere that was not the business. Paul Kim recommended that Sandra subpoena Gerald's personal bank records. Sandra had already begun that process through the appropriate legal channels, with the efficiency of a woman who had started making calls before she arrived at the office. She had also filed a missing persons report, which she explained to Delia was a necessary procedural step, even though Gerald Cole was not missing in any meaningful sense. He had chosen to leave, which was different, but the law required the same paperwork, regardless of whether the absence was voluntary. It was Paul Kim who found the warehouse lease on the third morning. He found it not in the visible accounts, but in a secondary file within the accounting software, a file that required knowing it existed in order to find it, which Delia had not known, which was the point. The lease was documented as a storage expense and had been running for 4 years at a monthly cost that was neither suspiciously high nor obviously wrong, just a line item in the overhead that Delia had seen and processed and not questioned. The address was on Miller Road, 6 miles east of Clover Ridge. Sandra looked at Delia. She said, "Have you ever been to this property?" Delia said, "Gerald told me it was document storage. I never had reason to go." Sandra said, "I think we need to go now." They drove out on a Thursday morning. The rural road east of Clover Ridge ran through farming country that Delia had known her whole life. The fields that changed with the seasons, the farmsteads set back from the road behind windbreaks of old trees, the particular quality of November light in Middle Tennessee that is neither warm nor cold, but has a clarity to it that makes everything look exactly like what it is. She had driven this road hundreds of times. She had never turned onto the Miller Road property. The property was set back behind a stand of old oaks. The warehouse was visible through the trees as they turned in. A concrete block building from the 1970s, solid and unremarkable, with a corrugated metal roof and a wide sliding door secured with a padlock. The locksmith Sandra had arranged met them at the gate. He had the lock open in 4 minutes. The sliding door opened onto cool air, and the smell of paper, and the faint chemical smell of old filing systems. For a moment, the interior was visible only in the light that came through the open door, which was enough to see the general shape of the space. Shelving units down both sides, filing cabinets along the back wall, a folding table in the center with 2 chairs. Paul Kim found the fluorescent light switch on the left wall, and the tubes flickered on one by one and illuminated the warehouse fully. Delia stood in the center of the space and turned slowly. The filing was extensive, and it was organized. This was the first thing she registered, not the existence of it, which she had half expected once she understood they were coming here, but the organization of it. Gerald had not thrown things into boxes and stored them carelessly. He had filed systematically, by year and by client name, in the way of someone who intended to be able to find things and who understood that information is only useful when it is retrievable. The shelves and the cabinets together held what appeared to be decades of documents, sorted and labeled in the handwriting she had seen on countless memos and notes and client correspondence over 20 years. She recognized client names on the labels, farms she had been doing the books for since the practice began, small businesses whose accounts she knew the way you know the accounts of people whose financial lives you have spent years inside of. Names she had called that morning in the previous week, when she was going through the list of clients who needed to be informed that their bookkeeping service was in crisis. Names she would need to call again, she was beginning to understand, for reasons she had not yet fully grasped. Paul Kim had gone directly to the nearest shelf. He pulled a folder, opened it, read the first page with the focused attention of a man who reads financial documents the way other people read novels, tracking the narrative underneath the numbers, following the story that the figures are telling. He set the folder on the folding table. He pulled another. He read. He set it beside the first. He pulled a third and read it, and was still for a moment. And then he said, without looking up, "Sandra, you need to see this." Sandra went to the table. She read what Paul Kim had placed in front of her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Delia, come here." Delia came to the table and read what Sandra was pointing at. The folder contained records of transactions that had not appeared in the legitimate books of Marsh and Cole bookkeeping services. Payments received from clients, clients whose names Delia recognized, clients she had served faithfully for years, that had not been passed through the business account. Fees collected under service descriptions that did not correspond to anything Delia had performed or that the practice had offered. And in the folder immediately beside it, more of the same, from a different client, in a different year, with the same structure. She pulled folders for the next 3 hours. She pulled them systematically, working through the shelves from left to right, year by year. And what emerged from 3 hours of reading was the architecture of something that had been running alongside the legitimate practice for a very long time. Gerald had been offering accounting services to the practice's clients through a separate arrangement that he had not disclosed to Delia. He had been collecting fees for this work that Delia was actually performing, under the business's name and with the business's reputation, and retaining those fees for himself. The practice's clients had believed they were paying Marsh & Cole. Some of what they paid had gone to Marsh & Cole. Some of it had gone to Gerald Cole alone. She sat down at the folding table. She looked at the folders arranged in front of her. She looked at the shelving units along the walls with their years of careful filing. She looked at the folding table and the 2 chairs and thought about Gerald Cole sitting in one of those chairs in this warehouse, maintaining these records with the same care he had always presented to the world, building the documentation of his dishonesty with the same methodical attention that she had been bringing to the legitimate books 6 miles away in the office on Birch Street. She was not devastated. She had thought she would be devastated, and she was not. She was something colder and more useful than devastated. She was clear in the way that you become clear when the fog that has been obscuring something for a very long time is finally removed, and what is underneath is visible in its actual shape, without the distortion of hope or trust, or the comfortable assumption that the person you have worked beside for 20 years is who they have presented themselves to be. She said to Sandra, "Every client in this building needs to know, not a letter, a call, from me." Sandra said yes. Delia said, "Every amount that was taken from them needs to be documented precisely." Sandra said, "Paul will do that. It will take time." Delia said, "I know." She looked at the shelves. She said, "The building is leased in the business name." Sandra said, "Yes. Technically, you have authority over it." Delia said, "Then it is mine. I am keeping it." Sandra looked at her. Delia said, "I am keeping the building and I am going to do something with it." Sandra said, "What?" Delia said, "I do not know yet, but I will." She made 43 phone calls over 3 days. She did not use a script. She had thought about using a script, had in fact written several drafts of what she might say, and had set them all aside because what 43 people deserved was not a script. What they deserved was her actual voice, saying what had actually happened, in the actual words that a woman says when she is telling the truth about something difficult. The calls fell into categories, though she did not think of them as categories at the time. There were the calls where the client had not been directly defrauded through Gerald's separate arrangement, and who received the news of his departure and the investigation with the controlled concern of people who have trusted a service and are now being told that the service has experienced a serious problem. These calls were difficult but not devastating. The clients in this category understood that what had happened was not a failure of the bookkeeping itself, and most of them wanted to know what Delia was doing to address the situation, rather than to express their feelings about it. Then there were the calls to the clients whose names appeared in the warehouse records. These calls were different. These were conversations in which Delia had to tell a person that money they believed they had paid to a legitimate service had been partially diverted without their knowledge by someone they had trusted, and that the amount in question was specific and documented, and that she was going to tell them exactly what it was. Some of these people were angry. A few were very angry, in the specific way of people who have been careful with their money because they have had to be, and who feel the particular violation of having that care exploited. Delia did not deflect the anger, or minimize it, or explain it away. She listened to it. She said she understood it. She said it was warranted. She said what she was doing about it. What she told every client in this category was the same. The records were in her possession. The amounts were being precisely documented by a forensic accountant. Her attorney was pursuing every available legal remedy, and Delia Marsh personally was going to make sure that every one of them had a complete and accurate accounting of what had happened to their money, and was represented in whatever process followed. She did not promise outcomes she could not guarantee. She did not tell them it would be resolved quickly. She told them what she knew and what she was doing, and then she stayed on the line for as long as they needed. The calls took 3 full days. At the end of the 3rd day, she sat at the kitchen table of the farmhouse on her 12 acres and looked at the list of 43 names with the notes she had made beside each one, and she added up the outcomes. 37 clients had told her, in one form or another, that they were staying. 6 had not. She looked at those 6 names for a while. She understood each of them. 2 of them were clients who had been most significantly defrauded and whose trust had been damaged in a way that extended, fairly or unfairly, to the practice as a whole. 2 had family members who were accountants and had been looking for a reason to consolidate the work. 2 had simply decided that this was a sign to make a change that they had been considering anyway. She did not try to change any of their minds. She thanked them for the years they had been clients, and she told them she hoped things went well for them, and she meant it. One of the 6 called back 6 weeks later. He was a 3rd-generation grain farmer named Harold Stokes, who had been with the practice for 14 years and who had left in the immediate aftermath of the calls because the anger he felt had required a target, and Delia was the available one. He called on a Tuesday evening and said, "I was not fair to you." She said, "You were upset." He said, "I was upset at the wrong person." She said, "You were upset at the situation." "Which is fair. I was the face of the situation." He said, "Can I come back?" She said, "Yes, Harold, come back." She drove to the Miller Road property on a Saturday morning in December, alone this time without Sandra or Paul Kim, in the gray morning light that December puts over rural Tennessee with the impartiality of a season that does not favor anything in particular. She parked at the gate and walked the 6 acres for 2 hours, which is a thing you can do with 6 acres if you are not rushing. And she was not rushing. She was looking. The warehouse occupied the northwest corner of the property, probably a third of the total acreage. The remaining 4 acres were fields that had been left without management since the farm equipment dealer closed in 2009. 15 years of a field doing what fields do when nobody is asking anything of them, which is to say, they had gone through the succession of growth that uncultivated Tennessee land goes through, from the first weedy colonizers to the grasses that replaced them to the early woody plants that were beginning to establish themselves at the edges. It was not beautiful in the way that managed land is beautiful. It was honest in the way that unmanaged land is honest. She had grown up around farming. She had watched her father read the land the way she read accounts, not for what it looked like at a given moment, but for what it told you about what it was capable of. She walked the 4 acres and read them in that way, asking not what they were, but what they could be, in the hands of someone who understood what they were working with. What she saw was good soil that had been resting for 15 years. Soil that had been used properly before it was left, and that had spent a decade and a half replenishing what the years of use had taken. Soil that would respond, she thought, with the gratitude of land that has been given time. She called Frank Dowd from the property. He was 81 and had owned the property since the farm equipment dealer's estate had sold it in 2011 and had been unable to move it since because rural commercial property in that county was not moving, and because he was 81 and did not have the energy to develop it himself. He answered on the 3rd ring. She said, "Mr. Dowd, I am standing on your Miller Road property." He said, "The warehouse place?" She said, "Yes." He said, "You are the bookkeeper lady, aren't you?" She said, "I am." He said, "I heard about your trouble with your partner." She said, "Yes." There was a pause. He said, "That is a hard thing." She said, "It is." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you want?" She said, "I want to buy the property. All 6 acres. He said, "It is not cheap." She said, "I know what it is worth, Mr. Dowd. I have been doing accounting in this county for 20 years. I know what rural property on Miller Road sells for." He was quiet again. Then he said, "Come to the house Monday. We will talk." She said, "I will be there at 9. She was there at 9. They sat at his kitchen table, which was a kitchen table of the kind that elderly men who live alone keep, functional and slightly worn, and with a coffee pot that had been on since 6 in the morning. She drank the coffee without comment, and they talked for 2 hours about the property and what it was worth, and what she intended to do with it, and who she was, which was the question Frank Dowd was really asking through all the other questions. At the end of 2 hours, he said, "All right." She said, "All right what?" He said, "All right, we have a deal." She said, "We have not discussed a price yet." He named one. She countered. He accepted her counter without negotiating, which told her that her counter had been fair, which was the only way she had known how to make an offer. She bought the property. The settlement from the practice's accounts, the portion that Sandra had been able to recover in the immediate term, covered the purchase and left enough to begin what came next. Not comfortably. With the specific financial tightness of someone who has committed everything to a direction and has no margin for second thoughts. She was not accustomed to having no margin. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that the absence of it clarified rather than frightened her. The first thing she did with the warehouse was clean it properly. She spent 2 Saturdays in January removing everything Gerald had filed there, folder by folder, box by box, cataloging it with Paul Kim's assistance, and turning it over to Sandra for the legal process. When the last of Gerald's files had left the building, she stood in the empty warehouse on a cold January afternoon and looked at the shelves and the cabinets and the folding table and the 2 chairs and the concrete floor and the fluorescent lights, and she thought, now it is mine. Now it can be what I decide it is. She moved the practice into the warehouse in February. The office lease on Birch Street had expired at the end of January, and she had not renewed it, partly for financial reasons, and partly because she had decided that the practice she was building was different from the practice she was leaving behind, and it did not need to live in the same space. The warehouse became an office in stages, the way things become what they are supposed to be when someone who knows what they are doing gives them time and attention and is not in a hurry to finish. She hired Cassie in the spring. Cassie was 28 and had grown up on a cattle farm in the next county and had a CPA qualification from the state university and had been working for a firm in Knoxville for 3 years and wanted to come home. She sat across from Delia in the new office, which still smelled of the renovation, but had good light and a proper conference table and the kind of quiet that only rural properties have, and said, I heard what happened with your partner, and I heard what you did after. Delia said, what did you hear? Cassie said, I heard you called every client yourself, that you stayed on the phone as long as they needed, that you told the ones who had been stolen from exactly what happened and exactly what you were going to do about it. She paused. That is the kind of practice I want to work for. Delia looked at her for a moment. She said, when can you start? Tom Garrett came in the summer. He was 63 and had spent his career in agricultural finance and had retired and discovered within 6 months that he was not a man suited to retirement. He had heard about Marsh Rural Financial Services through the County Agricultural Extension Office, which had become aware of what Delia was building and had mentioned it in connection with a program they were developing for farm succession planning. Tom drove out to Miller Road on a Tuesday morning and walked around the property before he came inside, which told Delia something about him, and then sat down and said, I think what you are building here is what this county needs and has not had. She said, I think so too. He said, what would I be doing? She told him. He said, I will take it. The practice became Marsh Rural Financial Services in the second year. Not a rebrand. Delia did not have the patience for rebranding, which she considered a way of talking about change rather than making it. She changed the name because the work had changed. Marsh and Cole Bookkeeping Services had been a bookkeeping practice. What she and Cassie and Tom were building was something more comprehensive. Financial services that understood rural operations from the inside, that could help a family farm navigate the question of succession, that could tell a small agricultural business what its numbers actually meant for its future, rather than simply what they were. The 4 acres of field came into the plan in the second year. She had been leasing the grazing rights to 2 neighboring cattle operations on a seasonal basis, a modest arrangement that kept the fields from returning to scrub and produced a small additional income. In the second year, she formalized the arrangement with the help of an agricultural extension agent from the university, a young woman named Dr. Renee Park, who became one of the most useful people Delia had encountered in her professional life, and put the fields into a rotational grazing management program that was producing results visible to anyone who drove past on Miller Road. The fields began to look like what they were capable of being, green and managed and purposeful, the grass growing in the rotation that Dr. Park had designed, the cattle moving through it with the unhurried efficiency of animals who have found good pasture. The old oaks at the edge of the property stood over all of it, with the permanence of things that have been there long enough not to be impressed by anything happening underneath them. Gerald Cole was found in the third year. He had gone to a city in Florida, Tampa specifically, where he had established himself with the confidence of a man who does not believe he will be found, which is a specific kind of confidence that process servers and forensic accountants have spent their careers deflating. The process server Sandra had engaged found him in October of the third year, living in an apartment in a mid-range complex near the water, working under a variation of his name for a small financial services firm that had not investigated his background as thoroughly as it might have. The civil process was long and produced a judgment that was specific and documented and enforceable and recovered, over the following 18 months, a portion of what had been taken. Not all of it. Gerald had spent some and hidden some, and some would require litigation that would cost more than it recovered, which Sandra assessed honestly and Delia accepted. What the process produced was not restoration. It was accountability, a precise legal record of what had been done, by whom, to whom, and what the consequences were. This was not the same as full justice, but it was not nothing. And Delia had learned, in the course of this year, not to confuse what she had with nothing, simply because it was less than what she deserved. The clients who had been defrauded received the documentation Paul Kim had prepared and were represented in the proceedings. Most recovered meaningful amounts. All of them had, from the moment Delia had called them, a complete and accurate account of what had happened. She had promised them that. She had delivered it. She drove to the Miller Road property every morning, not because the commute from the farmhouse was pleasant. It was 6 miles of rural road in all weather, but because arriving at the property in the morning and seeing what it had become was the thing that had replaced, as the organizing experience of her professional life, the Tuesday mornings on Birch Street. She had watched the Birch Street intersection for 20 years. She was watching the Miller Road fields now, and what they were doing was more interesting. In the spring of the third year, the fields were in their second full rotation under Dr. Park's management, and were producing the kind of grass that makes cattle farmers look at a property with the specific appreciation of people who understand what they are seeing. 2 of the farms that grazed the fields had become clients of the practice in the second year, which was not a coincidence. It is difficult to lease land to someone for 2 seasons without developing the kind of relationship in which financial services become a natural subject. Cassie had passed her senior CPA examinations in the second year and was handling a full client portfolio of her own, with a specialization in farm business planning that had developed from the specific needs of the clients she had been working with, and that was, by the third year, the thing that distinguished Marsh Rural Financial Services most clearly from the other accounting practices in the county. Tom had brought in 2 farm succession cases in the second year and 3 more in the third. Families navigating the transfer of land and operations across generations, with the complexity that such transfers always carry, and that requires someone who understands both the financial and the human dimensions of what is happening. The client list stood at 61 in the third year. Not all of them were from the original 43. Some were new, referred by existing clients or by the county extension office or by Tom's network in the agricultural finance world. But all of them had been taken on with the same commitment that Delia had made to the original clients on those 3 days of phone calls. I will know your operation as well as you do. I will tell you things about it that you did not know, and I will be completely honest with you about what your numbers mean. She had not broken that commitment to a single client. She did not intend to. On an April morning in the third year, Delia sat at her desk with her coffee and looked out the window at the fields and the old oaks and the Miller Road that ran past the edge of the property toward Clover Ridge. And she thought about the Thursday in November 2.5 years ago, when the fluorescent lights had come on in the warehouse, and she had turned slowly in the middle of it, and seen what Gerald Cole had built in this building over 4 years of careful dishonesty. She had stood in the center of that and seen it clearly, and had said, "The building is mine. I am keeping it. I am going to do something with it." She had done something with it. Not what Gerald had used it for, not the careful documentation of 20 years of taking from people who trusted him. Something that used the same building and the same 6 acres and the same rural road and the same county and the same community of farms and small businesses, and that was, in every way that mattered, the opposite of what he had built here. She drank her coffee. She looked at the fields. She had work to do, and she was glad of it. If you have ever discovered that the person standing beside you was not who you believed them to be, If you have ever had to call the people who were hurt by someone else's dishonesty and tell them what happened and stay on the line for as long as they needed. If you believe that what we build on the ruins of what was taken from us can be more solid than anything built on deception, then Delia's story belongs to you. Because she did not rebuild what Gerald Cole destroyed. She built something he never could have. Because the foundation she built on was the one thing he had never understood the value of. Her word. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that honesty is not just a value, it is a foundation. And a foundation, when it is solid, holds everything you build on it. Thank you for being here with us today. We will see you in the next story.